You're listening to the official Reformed Stoic Podcast, covering politics, philosophy, theology, conspiracy theories. I'm ready to get to the bottom of this life. Are you? Join Wolfgang, Sketty Squad, Purity Gang, as we strive to take dominion over this dying planet. I am Reformed Stoic, and this is my podcast. All right. Mic check. How is the game? Yeah, I think the intro's alright. I thought about remaking it at some point, but that's pretty low on my list of priorities. It gets the job done, baby. Well, I never cease to surprise myself with how last minute I can throw a podcast together. I know that doesn't sound good to the people, but it ends up working out, bro. It just goes to show, like, how much information is out there. You know, I can really just throw a search into Google, pull up the first article that comes up, and maybe it's not the best article, but it's not necessarily about reading the best articles, boyos. You know, sometimes picking apart a bad article is makes for a great podcast as well. But today, really kind of last minute throwing the topics together, last minute doing the search. But we got a show for you, and I think it's going to be a good show. So it just goes to show how interesting it is to do a podcast, because sometimes you can just really throw it together and it works out. So let's live it. Another interesting thing about today's podcast is I took a little bit of marijuana smoke maybe 15, 20 minutes ago. So I usually put the article first and then the videos, but today we're going to watch the videos first, because I don't know. I feel like watching some videos.
Hey, Tech Light here.
I feel like watching some videos, man. Let's go. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I say this to you with sore legs, because I've been skitting it in the gym. That's right, the home gym. Let's live it and skit it. You're listening to the Reformed Stoic News segment. Let's go! Oh yeah! Okay. Off to a little bit of a bumpy start here, but we got this, baby. We're veterans. We're veterans of the podcast game at this point. Let's get the chat situated. And let's get cozy for movie time. Going the Joe Rogan route. Nice. Let's go. It's about putting out content and for the boyos and creating interesting conversation. I just feel like time is moving really fast, so I keep feeling like there's not enough time to do everything. But we're doing it, and we're going to keep getting better. Movie time.
But then here's where things get interesting. 28% of millennials, so almost 1 out of 3 millennials, aged 26 to 40, say their parents still are giving them some form of financial support. So this past year, get this, Jenny, I want to get your thoughts on this. 52%, more than half of millennials, were still living in their parents' home. This is the highest number ever. It surpassed the previous record, which was freaking during World War II in 1940, when 48% of young adults lived with their parents. I'm going to throw a couple stats out there, and then we're going to weigh in on this topic real quick. Okay, so overall, 55% of Americans say their parents have helped them financially at some point during adulthood. So that's over 50%, 55%. That includes things like paying for college, understandable, but then you get into things like living at home rent-free, buying them a car, that's 16%, and then minor things like paying for their cell phone bill or even car insurance. The average amount that parents are giving their adult children is $4,200 a year. I almost choked up a little bit, Jenny, okay?
Take a breath.
So on the flip side, 21% of Americans currently provide financial support for their parents. I'm in that category. I help my mama out. So this is me. So bottom line is, for a lot of you young adults out there, thank God for the bank of mom and dad. So here's where I'm going to open it up to the lovely ladies. And Jenny, I'm going to start with you. Be honest.
Yes.
When did your parents cut you off financially, or are your parents still helping you out at all right now?
So my parents did help me a lot financially growing up, right?
Okay.
Yeah. I was a professional dancer, so I was touring the world with different artists. I wasn't home a lot.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and chime in here. What it is it's giving up, man. A lot of people are starting to give up. There's kind of this rite of passage that's been a thing in the American way of life, and it seems like it just didn't translate too well. We didn't make a smooth transition with all these social norms and rite of passage in these new times. There's something about life in our generation that's different. Something has changed. Like, the result is different. Boomers were, I was out of the house at 17 and I had my own apartment and I worked a number of shitty jobs. Well, clearly something has changed. And if you want to say that what's changed is that the millennials are a bunch of wimps, you have every right to posit that as an answer. But the bottom line is that something is different, because we're doing the same expectations of you're out of the house at 18 and you got to make yourself into a man, which, by the way, women, that's part of what is expected of women too. Part of this modern paradigm is that, now listen up, Susie, life's not all about handouts. You got to go get a college degree and you got to go get a job and you got to go take care of yourself, like the same exact rants, the same exact lectures that are given to boys. Like, you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and you got to go make a living. They're teaching women the same exact thing. So you got to keep in mind, guys, when you're bashing like modern, enlightened, liberal women, a lot of them, that's just what they're being taught. That's what they're being taught at home and at school. There could be girls who are drop dead gorgeous, 10 out of 10, and what they should do is basically just like hang around town where there's a bunch of high status men and be selective and find a guy who will take care of you and raise your kids and like basically just find a man. Like, ultimately what the best women should be doing, and you just kind of like according to genetics, just kind of according to DNA, like what the best men should be doing is creating a high level income and then finding one of the best women and having a family. And what the best women should be doing, just by our design, is finding a high status man and getting married. But we're living in this modern lie where it's like, everybody, boys and girls, come on up, girls, like pull up a seat, bucko. Oh, have I got some news for you female buckos? Like, I've been waiting to tell these lady buckos. Like, you're getting the same line that we're all fed, the American dream. We're all competitors in a capitalist system that has not evolved to do anything for families. It's not evolved to do anything for people. The only language that capitalism speaks is more growth, more profits and growth, higher supply, higher demand, and it just wants to grow, and it grows in an insensitive way that doesn't acknowledge like what's good for families, what's good for raising kids, what's good really for creating workers either. But okay, so it does. See, workers are intimate to how profit is made. So they can't skip over that, but they just outsource the labor. They just outsource the work. Anytime things get hard, instead of addressing some sort of a population problem here, we just bring in foreign work, and we just bring in new workers, and then you're racist if you say anything about it. But ultimately what's going on is your people are kind of being overlooked. So that's my introductory rant. Introductory. It's a new word. I invented it. Let's go.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I didn't find it reasonable to be renting an apartment that I'm not going to be in.
Okay, makes sense.
With that being said, my parents allowed me to live rent-free and save my dollars. My mom's an accountant, all right? That's why I'm really big with financing, because I believe that you need to save your money.
Mm-hmm.
Use it wisely, like still have your fun. I don't need everything sitting in the bank account. However, I was somebody that I never wanted to rent. I wanted to buy.
Okay.
So at the age of 25, I left and I bought myself a place.
In Miami?
In Miami.
Wow.
It was my biggest investment. So instead of
by the way, you hit it before everyone started moving to Miami.
Yes.
Well
right?
done.
Which was crazy, right? Because COVID just hit, and I was like, no.
So we got to hear this girl who's ultimately like one of the lucky few. She must have some sort of clout. I mean, it's not like the show gets that many views, but yeah, she's on this channel. She's some sort of a hot shot. No, she bought a house when she was young, and it just kind of seems the pace they're setting here is to just kind of like judge all of us for failing. And you definitely see these articles, and in defense of the boomer, which is something you'll hear rare around here. You'll seldomly hear that being said around here. But I do feel like they're being put on the defensive at this point. A lot of people are starting to be outspoken against boomers, so they're starting to fire back. And of course they fire back by saying that we're lazy and entitled, and something went wrong, man. Like, maybe our generation is lazy and entitled, but something went wrong, and it's being glossed over. There's a problem with the system. There's a problem with schools. There's a problem with what we're watching on TV. There's a problem with video games. There's a problem with social media. There's problems. Our kids are facing problems in this modern society, and I feel like it's not really being dealt with, or they deal with the side effects of the problem, but nobody really wants to deal with the problem. And what is the problem? What am I implying is the problem? Well, I know what a lot of people would want to say. I know what a lot of people want to insert right there. They like to blame all of the problems on a certain small group of people, and that, for the record, is not what I'm implying at all. That's more not really being willing to completely address the problem. Not everybody who works in the system is Jews. I'll just say it. Okay, moving on.
I'm sitting at home and I'm not working. Oh my God.
Okay, so I don't want to put your stuff out there, but you're 25.
I'm 20. Oh,
26.
This happened at 25, yes.
And currently, are your parents helping you out at all right now?
We got a couple good comments from Vlog City. Let's read these out. Basically, men have been outsourced to a point of non-participation. It will implode in less than 25 years unless we're replaced by more immigrants. Earlier, he's just saying a lot of men are just not participating because, we're not benefiting as much from our participation. It's more like failure is caused by parents' lack of successful structure. Notice how she said her parents an accountant, and emphasized assets and money. Absolutely, man. That's a part of how you enter in the game. We're playing this game of life, and we have to live up to these expectations and achieve certain objectives. And if there's no structure in your upbringing as a child, well, that's going to give you all kinds of problems when you're heading into the workforce. But ultimately, people want to focus on the competition of this, game to succeed and live up to expectations and survive. And something's changed, and people aren't taking it into account?
My car.
They help you with your car.
My dad's a car
So when you
dealer,
read these stats, are you like a little offended, or you're like, nah, it's cool?
No, I mean,
like,
I think it depends on the situation. Do you know what I mean?
Like you were on the road, it made no sense to have a full-time
right, and my dad's a car dealer. That's why I don't pay my car. You know, so
Okay.
it depends on the situation.
Gotcha.
Now, I do think parents need to find leeway and have their kids put in the work. Like some kids are sitting at home, like playing video games, eating chips, like. But if you see your kid putting in the work, some kids are visionaries and they have this dream of being an entrepreneur and creating this stuff. And right now they're focused on that and parents are supporting that. And I agree with parents supporting their kids' vision. However, I don't believe that they should be just without any responsibilities living rent free. There has to be an age gap. I mean, 30 still living at home, that's a little bit extensive.
I'm gonna actually get back to that.
You know?
Nancy, do your parents still help you out financially?
No, my parents actually never really gave me money. But the thing is, I lived at home for like up until I was 24.
Okay.
So as far as helping me out, it was just me not paying rent or paying anything.
Gotcha. So you paid no rent when you lived at home?
No.
How did you contribute to your family's well-being? Like, did you do chores? Did you assist in anything? Did you pay the utilities? What were you doing?
So it's weird because I lived with my brother and sister, actually.
Okay.
So
Not your parents, you're saying?
No. Yeah, no. I moved in with my sister. She ended up buying a big house, and then her and my brother shared it. So I just lived there, and they would ask for rent, but I would never give it, and it was just that.
Who would ask for rent and you would never give it?
My sister, but it was out of spite.
What does that mean?
Like, she was like, hey.
Ha ha ha, my family bought a great big house and I just lived with them and didn't pay rent. And a lot of people, that's not an option for them, you know? And I definitely acknowledge that I had some privilege going into my situation in Boston. But the whole problem with my life, which we're not going to get into too much, is just lack of planning. Like the plan to go to this super expensive school, it just wasn't a good plan because financially, you know, my parents couldn't handle it, and it was just all bad planning, man. But yeah, a lot of people, it's like you either make enough money to pay for a place to live, which usually amounts to being a one-room apartment, and a lot of people just can't do it, man. So you're just kind of stuck wherever you were planted, wherever you were born, you know?
Hey, give me money. I'm like, okay. And then
Give me money. You're like,
like, that was how I was living with my sister for like every month. It was just her asking money for me and my brother. Just to, I mean, she could definitely afford it.
Here's my question for you though. Okay, so everyone it's situational. Everyone has reasons. Like you were traveling. I get it. You know, you were living with your sister. But here's my question for you: what is an acceptable age to basically get cut off from your parents? Meaning, like, okay, 24, you're traveling. Okay, 26, all right, but still at 30? Because millennials are in their late 30s now. What's an acceptable age or an appropriate age for your parents to say, you're done? We're not giving you another freaking penny. What do you think?
Whatever the dating age is.
What does that mean?
As in, like, if you're 21 and then you're trying to take someone out, like, it is a little off-putting if they're still living at home, right? Like, for me, like, I wouldn't date anybody that was still living at home while I'm living alone.
So some dude takes you out. He's like, listen, we're going to go out to have a nice dinner. We're going to have a good time. And then we're going to go back to my parents' place and get it on. You're not into that.
No, not really.
Jenny, has a guy ever tried to take you back to his parents' place since, you know, you've been 21 plus?
Since 21 plus, no, but I've dated men who are successful.
What does that mean?
I'm just saying who are not.
Oh, God.
Listen to this input, dude. I mean, this is a great example of, like, no, if the point of the show is to, like, get high quality clips, a lot of time that doesn't happen. Like, this is just, he got a couple of airhead. They are women who are airheads. I'm not saying all women are airheads, but he got a couple of airhead women, okay? They're just like, well, I just date successful guys, and no, I wouldn't date a guy who lives with his parents. It's like, so are we really getting to the root of the problem here? Are we trying to make it better? America, let's hang American flags and get a couple of airhead women. Not saying all women are airheads, but it just sounds satisfying to say it like that. A couple of airhead women, and that's in the context of this discussion, that's ultimately what I think is the deal, because here we are. There's only 18 seconds left in the video, and I feel like we didn't really get anywhere other than, yeah, I lived in my parents' house. No, I would never date a guy. Or I lived at my sister's house. I never date a guy who lives with his parents.
Actually, you're saying you're like, no, I don't date broke dudes.
Yeah.
Ha ha ha, that's it. Ha ha ha, I don't date broke dudes. Well, I guess that's it. So, in conclusion, most millennials are living with their parents. Most millennials. I mean, that's what it says. Is that a clickbait art? Is that reality? Is that statistically proven that most millennials are living off their parents? Okay, living off their parents. But whoa, that's a big deal. Like the entire millennial generation. So most being over 50% are living off their parents. That's huge. And what conclusion do we get to here? Yeah, they asked me for rent, but she was just doing it out of spite. Tee-hee. My boyfriends are successful. I bought my own place. My mom was an accountant. I would never date a broke guy. Tee-hee. And I want to get to a point, I want to evolve the internet to a point where it's like, that doesn't reflect my opinion of all women, but ladies, I want some of the real ones out there to start understanding that there's male versions of assholes and there's female versions of assholes. The female versions of assholes sound like that. So it's the best I got for you, sweeties. All right, let's read some comments. As a 26-year-old guy, you can live at home with your parents and be the basement guy and be considered a loser. Or you can move out and find the best affordable place you can, like I did, at $600 a month, rent, and yet it still wouldn't be good enough for these superficial women. Yikes! Why does everybody always constantly saying bad things about women? Has anybody ever noticed that? In 2022, it just seems like so many problems just kind of somehow people ended up saying things like, these superficial women. Ladies, can we work on it? Can we work on it, ladies? Let's go. I personally enjoy having my own space, but the housing market is such a joke that it's not too bad for young people to be living at home right now. And, ultimately the problem is that women want, like, the top 10% of men. So in their eyes, it's like, I don't care what some chud incel who lives with his parents thinks. Like, they're more than happy to just run off with these 10% of chads who just say, you're everything, baby. You're a princess. You're so ahead of the curve. Now give it to me good. Times are hard for these days. Times are hard for people these days. Do whatever works for your family. And ultimately, yeah, you got to do whatever works for you, man. They say you shouldn't compare yourself to others. That's a very common piece of advice that you're given from adults in your life. You should not compare yourself to others. That's right. That's why I'm living at home, getting a little help from my parents while I try to get my life situated in a way that's going to be ideal for me to make the most money. Oh, no, you're a fucking loser who lives off of his parents, and, like, you're a complete leech. Like, in that regard, you should compare yourself to everyone. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, bucko. You're a huge loser. Don't ever take me saying don't compare yourself to others as don't compare yourself to others in terms of life, success, and attainment of material things, because when it comes to that, I'm comparing you to others, and I think you're a loser. Okay. Depends on the situation. I have a 26-year-old son who has ADHD and learning disabilities. Slowly, he is getting more independent. That said, he works and has saved almost $14,000. He will have a good down payment for a house and be in a good position to start a family. I would let any of my children move in and bring wife, children, etc. That is what family is for. We can help each other. Yeah, I think that's a good attitude. Like he has to have ADHD and a learning disability. I mean, if you ask me, her 26-year-old son, I don't really know anything about him, but whenever a woman says that a man, like, has all these mental illnesses, it's like, basically you pushed your son through the mental health machine when he was a kid, and they're like, hey son, how many times a month would you say that you feel hopeless? I don't know, I like playing video games. Like, can you just give me an answer? Okay, 20. Oh, 20. Well, if you feel hopeless 20 times a month, well, that means that you could have, like, borderline personality disorder or schizophrenia or ADHD. Like, he answered this question that he doesn't really have a lot of opinion on because he's just some bored kid. Like, oh my gosh, he has ADHD. He probably thinks his classes are boring. So they shove him full of Adderall and stimulants so he can pay attention in class when he just wants to watch Ninja Turtles and play video games. So all I'm saying is, like, us out here, all of these men who are struggling, we're probably not that much different than this 26-year-old ADHD and learning disability having person. Like, do we have ADHD and learning disabilities, or does he not really have ADHD and learning disabilities? I don't have any idea who he is, but it just kind of seemed like the fact that has to be said, it's like, yeah, we're helping him get money for a down payment on a house. I'm helping my son to save up money to get a down payment on a house. That's amazing. I feel like most, if not all, parents should do that, because she kind of says she's doing that because he has ADHD and a learning disability. But for a lot of people who don't even have that, quote unquote regular people, like, people could use this leg up. Things are very competitive, and I feel like the unspoken thing, part of it is that rich kids are cleaning up. Like, cronyism and nepotism, a lot of people got a leg up and they just win, and it's explained to you that it doesn't matter, don't compare yourself to others. But it seems like a lot of average working class men are just getting mollywopped, man. And they're getting it from all angles. Like, they're struggling to make it financially, and they're struggling to get women and make it in terms of social success. And they're just getting hit from both angles. And then they go bring it up to people, and people are like, oh, well, you're just a wimp, and you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and you're lazy, and your generation's lazy. And I definitely feel like I vibe with it. All right, anyway, this guy, we've actually heard some stories from this guy in the past. He went through a brutal divorce. Majority of U.S. adults now live with their parents, and why you should too. Interesting. And by the way, I didn't go over the show format. We're doing mental health in the United States. That's what we're doing next. First, we're doing people living at home. Then we're going to hit mental health in the United States. And then we're going to watch a little something about, I said Jesuits, but we're actually going to watch this video on the counter-reformation, which has to do with the Jesuits. So let's go.
Welcome back. So I have news for you, and it is that it is now trendy to live with your parents. According to research, 52% of young Americans, that's the majority of young adults in the US, now live with their parents for the first time since the Great Depression. And so here's a bit of news. If you are not living with your parents, then I would not consider you to be a very popular person, because you're going against the trend, which is to be moving back in with your parents. Maybe that's something that you should be considering doing. And don't just put that off. Maybe start packing your things right now. Let's take a look at some of this data. Generally, it's been about, say, 47% of young adults living with their parents. This year, it's gone up quite a bit due to the pandemic, and we're at 52% of young adults. And so I thought I would give you my perspectives on this as someone who has done both. I moved out, I lived in my own unit. I was living alone out in New York City, in San Francisco, in Japan, in London. And then at this point in time, I'm living with my parents. And it's not for lack of funds. I have millions of dollars in the bank, but I choose to live with my parents. And I thought I would explain to you the reasons why this is such a good choice. Now, first of all, it's important to realize that this whole concept of independence, that people in the West, we like to define that, hey, you're not independent if you're not living out on your own. It doesn't really exist, because no person is truly 100% independent, right? Like, you grow up, you're getting help from your friends, your teachers, your family, everybody around you is supporting you, your boss, your colleagues, and your network. And you may have even gotten your first job from a family referral or a relative who came and referred you into their job. And so because of that, as much as we like to tell ourselves that we're 100% self-made, independent, and we pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, that sort of thing doesn't really exist. We are interdependent on one another for not only the functioning of society, but also the enrichment of our own lives. And so I find it always a strange thing to say, well, you refuse help from your parents, but you're willing to go crash on your friend's couch. And so you won't live with your parents at home, but you're going to go live with your friend. Well, that doesn't really make sense. Why do you refuse help from one person, but then accept help from another person just because they're not your blood, because they're your friend. And not to mention, I think that if you were truly smart, you would be able to utilize all of the resources that you are born with, whether it be your parents, your circumstances, your society, your friends. Everybody's born with something. And you would do well to utilize 100% of the resources available to you to your advantage in order to get you as far as possible in life, instead of intentionally crippling yourself, getting rid of all of the resources that you were born with, intentionally cutting off help from people who are there to support you, and trying to say, well, you want to see if you can go do something 100% by yourself, all by yourself. And in a way, that's really like saying you want to see if you can climb to the top of Mount Everest all by yourself without any help from friends or family, because you just want to be able to call yourself independent, when in reality, I think the people who actually do reach the top use all the help that they can get. And there's really no shame in doing that, because when you were born, you were already getting help from other people.
I mean, if we can acknowledge that on some level white people have culture, I think, because, you know, we kind of recognize the kind of people that are around these circles. We got the kind of people who are maybe not so crazy about diversity as everybody else, and you just end up getting labeled as like a neo-Nazi. But if we could acknowledge some of these things that are kind of about like white culture and white, it really seems like it's part of like American white culture that like at 18 you get the royal boot and you got to make something of yourself. And I'll tell you what, that created a lot of very successful boomers. But I think the theory that's kind of developing is like a lot of these ultimately white male boomers who were very successful, they were kind of thrown out of the house, but they were thrown out of the house into a booming economy where basically they just had to do anything, and they literally had to do it. They had to try to survive, because I think there's kind of this gray area now where, I mean, ultimately, the millennials aren't just left out there to die. It's being shown like, okay, you don't have to make it on your own when they come crawling back. But, well, I mean, do white people have culture? I mean, is that something we could admit? Because, you know, we're talking about like Latino culture, which I'm very familiar with, like, that it's very common for Latino families to just like stay at home longer. So, I mean, is there any sort of a white culture? Is there kind of like white male American stereotypes? And well, I certainly think there are with boomers, because I can only just say from my experience, I've talked to a lot of white men who their dad has this kind of mentality, like it's so important to be out of the house at 18 and be thrown to the wolves and have to like overcome. And in this economy, that philosophy is just, it's not working. Like, we're running into a lot of problems and there's a lot of fingers being pointed, and I think there's a flaw with expectations, and there's just a number of flaws with culture. But anyway, let's keep going on the video.
Anyways, now another thing to know is that when I was younger, I remember I used to have a lot of issues finding a good reason to move out of the house. And that was because I didn't work a standard 9-to-5 job. Much of my time was being self-employed, working on my own apps, doing my own businesses. And so because of that, there was no location I needed to go to, no office I needed to go to in order to shorten my commute. And so I realized that generally the reason people move out and lock themselves into like a 1 or 2 year lease at an apartment and invest in filling that whole space up, you need a really good reason for that, and generally that's going to be having a job in a certain location. The thing is though, with the rise of remote work, where we can pretty much just work out of our own homes, and combine that with some people losing their jobs, getting laid off, and then you also have college students who their campuses are being closed, so they really have nowhere to go. All of these people are pretty much, they just don't have a strong reason to move out anymore, and the decision to do so becomes more and more difficult to justify, if it is even justifiable at all. And in terms of money, if you were to actually sit down and do the calculations on how much money you'd be saving, it amounts to a lot. But as a general rule, people usually say that they can spend 30% of their gross income on apartment rent. And when you consider that another 30% is going into taxes, then really you're spending 30% on rent, 30% on taxes, and 30% for your own discretionary spending. And so what that means is that your savings rate essentially doubles. Instead of having to work 10 years to save the same amount of money, you only have to work 5 years. Well, that's pretty great. I think you'll find that housing is an absolutely huge and massive expense, and it dwarfs almost everything else. And so when people say they want to save on iced coffee lattes, they want to clip coupons, they don't want to eat out at some expensive restaurant, what they fail to realize is that the initial decision to even move into some city to pay for that housing is already 10 times to 100 times greater than any of these other costs combined. Now, if you're to ask me why I, as a millionaire, am still living with my parents, well, it's not because of money. If all I had to do was pay some cash and I get a better, nicer quality of life, then I would do it, sure. But my life quality would actually deteriorate if I were to move out. And the reason for this are manifold. And one is because I have a dog, I have a pet, and I cannot manage this dog all by myself. And so my parents will occasionally help take care of the dog, feed her, take her out on walks, play with her. And can you just imagine if I were to go live in some skyrise apartment condominium in San Francisco, in which maybe I don't even have a yard, but it's going to be this luxurious penthouse suite?
What I'm starting to think of it is it's like thinking for your family versus thinking for the country, you know? Like, it seems like a very capitalist thing. Like, they want your children to become money-making, tax-paying entities as soon as they turn 18, you know? And ultimately, when there's a bigger house, I'm very familiar with this more. Like, you see it in the third world, and you see it in different cultures. Having a bigger home where more people live, everybody contributes to the house. Maybe some people make more money. Maybe some people do more around the house, work for the family. It's like thinking for your family versus thinking for the country, you know, for the economy.
I mean, it's not going to be a great quality of life for the dog, especially if it's just me living there by myself. I can't be walking the dog all the time by myself. It would cost me so much time. I would just be taking the dog in and out for walks, playing with her, feeding her full time, and that would just be my entire life. Not to mention, I think that our way of life is changing quite a bit, because these days, if you want to transport yourself somewhere else, you just put on a virtual reality goggle, or you get on the computer and you just interact with your social media and you live in this digital world. And so when I think about it, I spend most of my time in front of monitors, and that's really all I need to be happy and productive. I don't spend my time in some living room enjoying some physical space, observing furniture or rugs or chairs or sofas. And so this need for a physical space in order to call your own is just, it's not even higher on my priority list. Not to mention, I save a lot of time because a lot of the household tasks can be combined and shared among people. And time, well, time is one of the most valuable resources that anybody has today. And so, for example, cooking, cleaning, maintenance, repairs, and all of the upkeep of maintaining a house can be shared among people, and so my burden becomes less. And that goes the same for shared appliances, utilities, like the refrigerator can be shared, vacuum cleaner, microwave.
You tend to notice that psychopaths like glands here, people who have that like predatory, narcissistic, what is it, cluster B personality, cluster B, psychopathic, narcissistic, those are the kind of people who are suited best for this kind of economy that's ultimately ruled by psychopaths and narcissists. And you notice there's people like glands. Anybody who says they got money, they're a dick about it, and they want to like narcissistically fiend off of everyone. And God wouldn't be happy with the way that you're talking, buddy. I have a feeling you're not really a Christian, like, but I don't know. Who's to say? You sound like you're not very self-aware of how you sound.
Oven, tables, chairs, pots and pans, kitchen appliances, yard tools, internet, electricity, sewage, water, all of that can be
No, it's not because you buy property. That's not what I said. It's actually because of the way that you're talking to people in chat. And I think you knew that, but that's the thing about psychopaths like you, is your mind is so quick to just jump to whatever benefits you. You're like this animal, like your ego needs to survive at all costs. So your thinking just jumps right past logic straight to this weird predatory way of thinking where, nope, it's not because you buy property. It's because of the way that you're talking to people. Maybe you'll realize that someday.
shared. Otherwise, I would have to go out and buy a duplicate copy of everything just for myself. And I would not even derive any joy from owning any of this additional stuff, right? Like I don't derive joy from owning a separate laundry machine or refrigerator or microwave or toaster oven. And at least I have found that this whole lifestyle of living at home can enable some truly incredible opportunities. Like you save a lot of time and money. So for example, with the additional money you saved, like you could go buy a car if you wanted to with that. You could go pick up a new expensive hobby. You could do a bunch of travel with the additional time that you have. You could use it to learn an additional skill, start a side hustle, read some books, or get some additional exercise at the gym. And not to mention when it becomes safe to travel, then essentially living at home will enable you. It is the key to being able to live and travel remotely if that's your thing. Like if you want to be a digital nomad, then you really don't want to be maintaining a separate apartment that's going to be empty while you're out there traveling around renting other apartments, hotels, or Airbnbs, because at that rate you would be paying double rent. And it's just incredibly expensive to be paying rent for two places at the same time, and one of them is going to be empty. And so if you had a home base with your parents though, not only would you be saving massive amounts of money as you're living with them, but then when it comes time to travel, you could also take some pretty nice vacations, and essentially your rent money would be poured into the hotels that you would be staying at. And the best part about this is because it's this whole lifestyle that is entirely sustainable, you wouldn't even feel guilty about traveling and spending money on hotels and doing it long term, because all of the finances pretty much work out, and you'll find that maybe it's about the same or even cheaper than if you were to just rent some $3,000 apartment in the city. Now, I wanted to close by addressing when is it actually valid to move out of your parents' house. And first of all, it's important to understand that if you have to ask yourself, can you afford moving out of your parents' house to go live in some big city? If you have to ask yourself if you can afford something, then the answer is always no. And that's a common saying. If you have to ask yourself if you can afford a car, a watch, a bag, or anything, then the answer is going to be no. You want to be earning so much that it doesn't even affect your finances if you were to go out and purchase something. And usually it's going to come to a point where maybe it's just going to be a no-brainer for you to get this. Like for example, if you got married and you had kids and you just needed the additional space, then it's not a question that you ask if you can afford something. It just becomes a necessity at that point, and it becomes a no-brainer question. And then the other thing I would know is that I think it's important for people to be aging and experiencing life at the proper pace. And so if you reach a point in life in which you're thinking that you really want...
Yeah, I've heard quite a bit about BlackRock. They're a pretty creepy company. Just buying up tons and tons and tons of property. It seems like maybe there should be some laws put into place to protect people who want to live in homes, and maybe it should be a little bit less about investors who have access to money buying up all the property and leveraging it, and more about people who like want to live in a home, and people who, you know, don't take advantage of real estate. I mean, ultimately my dad does real estate, and it's so crazy, man. You know, when I was in middle school, I remember he said something to me. It's like, hey, you know, maybe we can like take some of your money that you have saved up from your dividends and put it into some property, and I can help you like learn how to manage some trailers. And boy, I'll tell you what, like if he would have actually followed through on that, that would have completely changed my life. Like if I would have got into property investments when I was in middle school, he just kind of said something to me about that once, and then it just never happened. And I suppose it should have been like, oh, he didn't show any interest, and I should have showed more interest. But yeah, I know a little bit about the benefits and the advantage of property investment.
Want to move out and you're going to regret this experience if you don't, then maybe you should just do that and get your fill, right? Like you could go rent a pre-furnished apartment at an Airbnb, maybe go live in an Airbnb for a month, get your fill of living on your own, and maybe after you've had your fill of living in a one-bedroom shoebox apartment paying $2,000 to $3,000 per month and having to maintain all of the stuff by yourself, and nobody's going to clean or cook after you, and you're just wasting a bunch of time with that. When you see the reality of that, then you may better be able to appreciate what you have living at home. And sure, living at home, maybe there's going to be some additional drama. Maybe you guys can't stand each other. And so I would recommend maybe just setting up some ground rules, not interfere in each other's life so much. Like really, this is about working with other people, teamwork skills. That's pretty much all it is. And sure, there's probably going to be challenges with that, but when you're challenging yourself, you're probably growing into a more mature person. So that'll do for me. Let me know though your thoughts on living with your parents. Would love to see in the comments below.
Yeah, man. I really wonder about why things played out the way they did for me, man. I just think a lot of it was just a lack of knowledge, but yeah, I'm not very happy with how things played out for me. I'll just say that. Okay, time for the article. I should be ready to do some reading now. Adults are living with their parents at unprecedented levels as crushing debt, a runaway housing market, and the pandemic make independence impossible. This is from just a few months ago. I'm just a digital nomad, bro. Just stare at the computer all day. A massive amount of young people moved back in with their parents due to pandemic-related struggles. The trend might be here to stay. A record number of Americans are back living with their parents, as the share of the U.S. population living in multi-generational households hits 18% last year, according to a new survey by Pew Research Center. The survey, which collected interviews from over 1,500 Americans of different ages and income levels last October, found that the number of multi-generational homes in the U.S. has quadrupled since the 1970s, a rate of growth far higher than that of other types of households. Younger millennials are by far the most likely to be living in a multi-generational household. Nearly one-third of Americans aged 25 to 29 do so, with the vast majority living with their parents. The most common factor behind people's decision to move in or continue living with relatives well into adulthood was money. Finances were the main reason to live with family for 40% of survey respondents, followed by caregiving commitments to older relatives. Over half of younger people with lower incomes cited finances as the biggest factor in their decision. A growing trend. Multi-generational living has been a growing trend in the U.S. for years. A major factor has been the rapid population growth of people of color. What? A major factor has been the rapid population growth of people of color in the U.S. over the past few years. A group Pew says is more likely to live with multiple generations in the same home. Interesting. That's like what we were saying earlier. People of color, it's part of their culture to live with their family longer. So I made that comment earlier, which I feel like was maybe not so well received. Like, well, is there some sort of a white culture? Because it seems like when you imply that people of color, like this article just said, live at home longer with their family, well, then does that imply that white culture is to not live with your family longer? I mean, I feel like it is that way. And yeah, I do see that boomer culture, like white culture American thing that was set. It's like you're out of the house at 18. You got to make it on your own. You got to be a real man. It seems like it's this rite of passage. And it's just, if everybody else, I mean, people of color, everyone who's not white is doing it differently, well, maybe they got this one right, Like, well, I think I've made a pretty good case for it, chop it up, but you keep making weird faces and not really elaborating on your feelings on it. You're more than free to tell me what your thoughts are on that. It seems like it makes sense, but it seems to be some sort of a cultural taboo, which, oh my gosh, don't talk about that. You're making everybody cringe. But if there is like a toxic culture trait of white Americans, well, then maybe it should be addressed and maybe it should be talked about. But yeah, it seems like I'm just talking to myself here. All right. Pandemic and a red-hot housing market have supercharged the popularity of these living decisions. In the first year of the pandemic, more than half of Americans under 29 were living with their parents. according to another Pew survey. The first time this had happened since data on the topic became first available in the 1940s. The earlier stages of the pandemic and the economic downturn hit millennials and older Gen Zs hard as college campuses across the country shut down and job losses hit record highs. These trends carried on into 2021, especially for younger Americans, as 58% of adults younger than 24 were still living with their parents last year, according to census data. The pandemic factor in the multi-generational housing boom may be beginning to wane. As restrictions are lifted and the economy rebounds, U.S. companies added 678,000 new jobs in February, while weekly unemployment claims recently fell to their lowest level since 1969. But even if the economy is recovering, young Americans may have another important reason to stay at home for the foreseeable future. You know, other consequences of people not having a culture, let's just sit on this for a second, because I find this this thing that's come up in the podcast today very interesting. Like when I say, is there such thing as white culture? And what it comes down to is you have to look at the original post-World War II United States. And this is another thing that brings up radio silence. Was the country primarily white to where you can acknowledge, okay, well, it's not racist to state a fact. The country was just 85 to 90% white in the 1950s post-World War II United States. So then as an extension of that, well, what Americans did, the culture that was created in 1950s United States, would that be safe to assume that is some sort of an American white culture? But as I unline this whole train of thought, everybody's like, cut the cord. No. Do the video. Do the video. Stop saying what you're saying. Stop saying, really? So white people aren't allowed to have culture. It's not okay to admit that the United States used to be primarily white. And I just feel like it's keeping this reality forever skewed, because that article straight up said that people of color live with their family longer. So was there some sort of a culture that was created in the United States in a time when it was primarily white people? And I feel like I'm scratching the surface of something here that's just not meant to be acknowledged. It's just not meant to be talked about. And I have to say, it's well, there are people who are white. We know that. We know that white people exist. And maybe you're setting yourself up for some sort of a midlife crisis when it's I don't have culture. I'm not allowed to have culture. And then you're I'm trying to find my roots. I'm trying to figure out who I am. It's you're white, you're racist, just shut up. Everything you're saying is racist. It's wanting to having a crisis of identity. Having a crisis of identity as a white male, that's racist in and of itself. And I gotta be honest with liberals and leftist people here. This is part of what sends white men to the alt-right. This crisis of identity, okay? People act when you say anything about being a white male, you're just being a racist, but there are white males. They do have feelings, and maybe there are some problems with this taboo white culture in the United States. And because it's not discussed, and because it's not allowed to exist, and because nothing I've said this whole time is ever acknowledged, I think that confusion and that lack of clarity is a lot of what sends white men off to be radicalized in 4chan, because there just seems to be this emptiness in our identity. The very American white identity is to just get out competed by minorities. And people will say, well, that's racist to say that, but people laugh when I say white culture, like there's no such thing as white culture. So are white people obligated to just be these bland, I think I'll put it on my credit card? I think it's part of the problem. I think I'm scratching on a very real problem here. And I don't know, man. If nothing else, it's some food for thought. So moving out right now is just way too expensive. America has been in the clutches of a historic housing crunch for most of the pandemic, and millennials are faring the worst in it. A low supply of available housing and soaring demand are causing home prices to increase seemingly every month, and younger Americans with lower incomes are simply getting crowded out of the market. To avoid spending life savings on a home they might regret, many millennials have opted to continue living with their relatives to wait out the hot housing market and save up money. The high cost of living in many cities is pushing more and more younger Americans to consider moving back in with their families. The trend has been compounded by the student debt crisis among younger Americans, 60% of whom say that their student loan debt is the biggest factor delaying their decision to buy a home. According to a 2021 poll by the National Association of Realtors. Renting isn't a much better option for Americans looking to move out either, as rents have also been warped by the real estate market. Rents hit an all-time nationwide high last January, and in some cities, the market has gotten so ridiculous that buying a home can actually be the more affordable option. The housing market won't cool off before next year, and for those looking to buy a home, living with relatives does seem to be the most cost-efficient option. The Pew survey found that people living in multi-generational households are the least likely to fall into poverty, a benefit that in most cases extends to unemployed young Americans as well. So that's a really hard-hitting last sentence there. I'm going to read that again. The Pew survey found that people living in multi-generational households are the least likely to fall into poverty. So it's better for not being poor to live in a multi-generational household. So, yeah. I understand that, people got to work and the country is built off of work, and it just seems like the way things were in the boomers' time, it reflected this everybody get out and work culture, but it seems like there's been so many big changes in society that all happened so rapidly. It has changed the very foundations of what it means to live in this country. And the solution from the system seems to be to blame our generation for having this adverse reaction and for basically failing to make it in this country. Something went wrong. And ultimately, this article is reflecting that, well, it's just saying what's happening. It's saying that adults are living with their parents at high levels. They do acknowledge issues with the housing market. But people are very quick to blame the millennials. People don't seem to want to explore the territory of if the millennials are not to blame. What if we entertained the idea of what if millennials are not to blame? I feel like that's dangerous territory that is taboo to explore. The safe explanation is that we're all just entitled and weak. Because if we started looking at other people to blame, well, I don't know, maybe there's some sort of a giant propaganda arm that extends into maybe like the CIA, like maybe the Central Intelligence Agency had some sort of propaganda initiative to send certain messages through television and music and the school curriculum, and it's just an example. It's just an example of a solution. Like maybe there were harmful messages in the television of our time or in the movies and the culture. Maybe something about the culture that we lived through was toxic. I mean, I remember Superbad. Superbad came out when I was in high school, a movie that's basically saying, yeah, it's normal for high schoolers to try to get drunk and party. and smoke weed and experiment with drugs and try to have sex. Like, it seemed like that movies like Seth Rogen movies, it seems to be very irresponsible. You know, like as a parent, you know that the popular movie right now is super bad, and your kid's a 17-year-old kid. It's like, well, this is setting an example, like what all high schoolers do who are worth a damn is, you know, steal booze and get drunk and try to get laid when they're drunk. And just an example. It's one of those things, it's like, oh, you're going to blame it all on Seth Rogen movies? It's like, well, I think that Seth Rogen movies are a piece of the puzzle of a bigger picture, and I can't help but feel like anytime I try to uncover this picture, it's not received very well. It's like, it's just for the best to take the easiest, most surface solution. It's that the millennial generation is defunct, lazy. We don't want to be conspiracy theorists now. Okay, moving on to the mental health crisis. Let's go.
This is The Weekly on ClickOrlando.com with Justin Warmoth.
Good morning, I'm Justin Warmoth. Throughout the pandemic, there's been a lot of attention on not only physical health, but mental health as well. This week, nonprofit Mental Health America released its annual report focusing on two areas: the prevalence of mental illness and access to treatment. That report found nearly 50 million Americans, almost 20%, are experiencing some sort of mental illness, and more than half do not receive treatment. This morning, Schroeder Stribling, Mental Health America's president and CEO, is here to break down the report and discuss what needs to happen to address this growing crisis.
What sticks out to you, and what factors were considered when delivering these rankings?
Well, first of all, thanks for asking about it, and thanks for shining a spotlight on mental health. Mental Health America has been producing this report for 8 years. And what we have seen over those 8 years is unfortunately a negative trend in the two things that we're tracking. And we're tracking essentially prevalence of mental health conditions. So how many people have mental health conditions, both youth and adults. And we're also tracking access. So of those people, how many folks are getting to actual access?
So what pieces of data stick out to you that alarmed you, and what needs to happen to address some of the regular occurrences that we're seeing and the increases year over year?
Yeah, really excellent questions. And one important framing point about our report is that it's actually a snapshot from 2019. That's really important to note, because that means that we have not recorded the data from these years of 2020 and 2021, where we know the picture will be worse. So with that in mind, we're already alarmed at what 2019 looks like and this trend that we've been watching for years. When we look at prevalence in adult mental health, you see in 2019 that 50 million Americans, adults, were experiencing a mental health condition during that year. Also for youth, about 10% of youth in general,
Peace out, honest man.
15% of youth of color. In those groups, about less than half of the adults who need services for a mental health condition are receiving them, and only about,
and the people of color, and the people of color, and the people of color. Oh my gosh, you're a neo-Nazi. I mean, am I though? How we're like 11 podcasts deep, and how many times have articles said, especially in people of color, especially in people like, you guys care about your white bros? I feel like nobody likes white men who aren't Chad Thundercock. Like, does it just kind of feel that way? Like, the way that they separately address people of color is like, some white people aren't doing so great either. Like, does anybody care? Everything you're saying is racist. It's like, but no, like, there's all kinds of white men who are fucked up and they're unhappy, and yeah, we know you're school shooters and incels and you're the bad guys. You're the bad guys. It's like, don't you think that maybe a lot of men who felt like they were misunderstood and felt like society didn't care about them maybe kind of embraced that villain ideology that's opposed to your ideology because they feel like they don't belong? I mean, the part of me that used to like believe in what this society was about, the part of me that used to more or less be a liberal and like believe all this stuff about women's rights and equality and diversity. I mean, being like thinking back to who I was back then and having that person look at me in my worst moments, it's like society let you down, bro. Your life got a little bit hard and everybody let you down. And who's there with fucking open arms, like waiting for you, dude? Who's there? Who understands? Who's gonna listen? Who understands your problems? Who's there for you, buddy? Pepe the Frog and fucking Hitler memes and far right reactionary extremists on the internet, dude. That's really what's happening. And I feel like I'm saying this right now because nobody else will say it, dude, because everybody in my circles is so far gone that we've already rejected this idea of all of these liberal values that society posits. But the part of me that used to believe in this is like, you know, if people would just stop dehumanizing white men, if people would just say, you know, instead of having this special section and people of color are facing this much mental health, and people of color are experiencing poverty, and people of color do this, and people of color do that. It's like, you know, you're talking in a very segregated manner. Like we don't get to sit at the same news section. Like white people have to have their own, but there is no white people section. That would be racist. But people of color have like their own news section anymore. And it's like, so you guys don't want to hear the same news as us, or we're really just like segregated already. It's weird. It's like segregation isn't allowed and it's celebrated that we desegregated, but now we have a colored people section of the news. And it's like, it seems like desegregation is really just segregation all over again, but I guess like on everybody else's terms, which is like nobody likes white people and you're racist if you talk about it. So I don't know, just some of my thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts today. Maybe it's because I'm high.
And 60% of youth are not receiving services. So,
I mean, like, if anybody wanted to try to fucking fix the country and you wanted to try to de-radicalize the alt-right and you wanted to try to, like, help some of these lonely, confused, broken men, be like, hey, buddy, you know, Hitler actually killed a lot of people and you're better than this, and let's have a talk. Like, we're not going to judge you for, like, the radical things that you fell into. Like, if anybody wanted to, like, try to, like, you know, undivide the country and try to, like, help all the men, maybe try to get some of these men who are leaving the workforce to, like, go back to work. And, you know, maybe if you wanted to stop society from fucking collapsing, you could listen to some of the commentary that I have, because I think I have some great insights on how you could, like, entice some of these men to come back to society. But you're not listening to anything I'm saying, are you? You're just thinking about how fucking racist I am, or, like, how much of a Nazi I am. And the thing is, guys, is this country is asking for it, okay? I used to have a more radical position than I hold now. I've definitely chilled a lot. I've watched myself become a lot less radical over the years as I, like, get a sense of what's happening on the internet and why so many people are being radicalized. And it's just like, what this country has done, what people are saying in terms of, like, culture, how, what the schools expect white men to listen to, because this country was very recently majority white. I don't know if it's okay to acknowledge that, but what you expect young testosterone-filled white men to sit into a class and listen to, and what men are thriving in that. And we see it's the soy boys. Actually, you need to fact check your white privilege, because when you have chest muscles, when you can, like, rep your body weight on bench press, when you can, like, squat maybe at least more than 2 plates, when you got a little bit of testosterone and you're a man, it's really fucking hard to sit there and listen to like how horrible your people are, like how horrible your race is and how guilty you need to feel. It seems like this kind of like societal liberal guilt that people want white men to have. Men who have like any testosterone, men who have ever gotten laid, men who can put up any fucking weight relative to their size in the gym, it just doesn't seem to be like resonating well with them. Like they would rather fucking join some sort of a movement that takes society away from you. So I wish I could help, man. I wanted to be like a guy in the movie. How do I reach these kids? I think I'm a good person. I think I have good morals. I think I can help people. But I feel like I'm always in these really radical parts of the internet. It's like society asked for this, bro. Like, I don't think it's right for there to be a Nazi uprising, but the way that this fucking country talks to white men is like, you're asking for some sort of like a radical white nationalist uprising. And I think they are asking for it. I think it's a plot from our CIA. I think they, there's something to the Southern Israelites Dreyfus affair, and they really want radical white people to fucking do something and flip out. Like they're poking a stick. It's like a joke. It's like, and all of the racist white men should suck a dick. Like, they're just trying to see what they can get away with. It's like, we're really supposed to go to school and listen to this shit? Like, I just think it's like a big joke. Like, force feeding us all this modern liberal propaganda. It's like, can you guys hurry up and balkanize already and fucking try to do something so the military can weaponize against you? Like, anyway, back to the format.
So in Florida, according to the rankings, we are 49th in access to care. And that's what you're talking about.
I felt like I was on a conveyor belt that led to like, okay, here we are. Like, you get off the airplane and like, there's Pepe, there's Hitler, there's like, Julius Evola, revolt against the modern world. It's like, wait a second, I didn't buy a plane ticket here. Like, I didn't really want to be this. I didn't really want to be like a super radical bad guy, but everybody left me. Everybody pointed fingers at me when I tried to say anything about it. People were nasty to me. It's like, damn, dude, like there's just this conveyor belt that's leading so many average white men to becoming radical white nationalists. And I am afraid there's been too much damage for it to be undone. We all know that there's never going to be any understanding from the left. And it's just like, I don't know, man. Rev up those fucking tanks, I guess. I don't know. I feel like it didn't have to be this way.
What does access to care look like? And especially given the circumstances and where we're going, what needs to be addressed?
Great question. Access to care represents a range of different things. However you get from your need to the provider and the services that you want. So that could be having insurance at all. It could be having adequate insurance, could be having insurance that covers mental health and primary health care in parity, which is the law, but sometimes not enforced. But it could also be things like
rev up those fryers.
Having a parent who can take the time off so that they can take you from school to a mental health appointment. Or it could be if you need to use a telehealth option, if you're in a rural area, having the option, but also having the broadband infrastructure.
These people are just like talking heads, dude. I have a feeling we're not going to watch this whole news segment. This is just some like shitty, unknown, 364 views, like October 21st. This is just some report that like nobody cares about, dude. It's just talking heads. Well, there needs to be more options for boys, and like I'm going on these like passionate rants that have nothing to do with this news segment, and like, dude, oh look at that, she's got the rainbow flag. Like, these people don't understand. Everybody at this point knows that the talking heads don't understand. Like, the heads of society, they are not going to acknowledge what really happened. They're not going to acknowledge what's really happening. Women's liberation is a problem for young men, and that cannot be acknowledged in the school systems. That cannot be acknowledged on the news. The shifting demographic in the country is causing cultural shifts and changes. That cannot be acknowledged. That cannot be discussed in a non-biased way. The agenda of academia at this point, this very like, if you want to have a place in society, you have to smile and make peace with the radical far left agenda. It's not capable of solving problems anymore. Like, it is the problem. These people are the problem. They're causing the mental illness. They're causing people to leave society. Like, I don't know. Let's listen to this woman talk for another 5 minutes, and I'm just going to sit here in awe of like how they're not helping anybody.
That supports it. So access is a lot of different things. One of the things that states have done that really does improve access is the expansion of Medicaid. We know that that makes a difference in how many people get to treatment. That's not something that Florida has done yet. So that might be something that affects the access rating.
You mentioned nearly 50 million Americans, about 20% are experiencing a mental illness. What about like the undiagnosed others who might not know that they have some sort of mental illness going on?
And what is mental illness? Okay, it's like, is that the problem? Is that why men are leaving the workforce? Is that why men are leaving college? Is that why people aren't getting married? Is it all just mental illness? I mean, and are you born with mental illness, or do you become mentally ill over time? Because I think I can compromise. It's like, maybe these men have become mentally ill, but this society did it to them. This society has done this to us. Like, we're just not wanted. We're spoken as a burden. We're not acknowledged. There's a separate section of news for everyone other than us. And what happens when the statistics show that the majority of mental illness is in white men? And I'm sure they're going to show that because it's beneficial to their narrative. But we're being hunted by this culture. We're this punching bag. We're this foundational obstacle for people in America to overcome, for women to overcome. Women used to be slaves and property of men, for minorities to come. So white women and all the minorities of the world, they overcome the obstacle of the patriarchy. But what about the men who used to be the patriarchy? What's our place in society? What do you want from us? What's meant for us? Where are we wanted? What's our plan? Like, what's our place? Are we really just the enemy? Because if you're going to make it a part of your curriculum that we're the enemy, then why are you surprised when we all stand against you? Like, they really just want us to just lay down our arms and lay over and fucking die and let everybody walk all over us? And I don't know, man. I don't think we really knew what we were signing up for when we were kids, because I remember hearing about how horrible, white people were during like the Civil War, or, when we were expanding the United States, what we did to the Indians and all of that. And I guess it didn't fully occur to me when I was a kid. It's like, you're going to grow up someday to be a white man. You're going to be a white male adult, and this anger is pointed at you, and this society represents interests of people who feel this way,
and they're just living their lives.
Yeah. Well, part of it depends on, is it giving someone distress, right? That they, and is it disrupting their functioning in some way within their family or at their employment, et cetera. On the presumption that it is, one of the things that we recommend is, if people have any concerns about their mental health, that not to guess about it, but to check. And we have ways through Mental Health America, people can use our free online confidential screening program. Over these past 2 years during the pandemic, we have seen an over 600% increase in the number of people using that program. You can screen yourself for depression or anxiety, thoughts of self-harm or suicide. That's a first step for many folks who may be, as you say, undiagnosed or uncertain about what's going on.
There still is, and I think it's getting better, but you would know better than me, there is still a stigma surrounding mental health. Whether it's
put a little baby poopy pants in timeout. You need to take some time to think about what you said, buddy. Try to learn.
Someone might just be ashamed to admit that they're not there. They're having trouble. Addressing the stigma, how big of a priority is that for you and what you do?
it's fundamental, and I'm so glad that you raised it. It really underlies everything, that if we can make advances against stigma, that will help us make advances in mental health overall. One of the things that we're really focused on here is ensuring that that's.
Well, ultimately, I should not try to talk over the video. I should just pause. Yeah. I shouldn't be trying to talk over the video.
Part of all of our advocacy efforts, that we're addressing the bias that has naturally been baked into mental illness. We know that we all have mental health, just like we all have health. 5 in 5 of us have mental health. By the overall statistics over the course of our lifetime, most of us will be affected by either directly by a mental health condition, or will love someone close to us who's affected by a mental health condition. So it is personal for all of us. Mm-hmm. I see hope this year that there's much more public conversation about mental health, just like we're having right now.
Right. We've seen a number of athletes come out and say that it's okay not to be okay, and they address what they're going through and what the pandemic has really done. But I think that's really opened a lot of eyes, whether it's
I have a feeling the comments will be much more interesting than this video. Nobody's. Yep, we're all nuts. Okay. Literally nobody cares about this video, so that's enough of that. Let's go on to the next one.
Disturbing trend emerging as more people get back into their everyday lives after the pandemic. As medical reporter Liz Bonis explains, mental health concerns are at an all-time high.
Hey there, everybody. As anxiety and depression rates soar in this pandemic time, healthcare providers say if you notice a few things that are not typical for you, might be time for a mental health check.
My whole life, I've been trying to relieve this thing where I'm trying to please other people, all that kind of stuff. And it turns out that also equals anxiety, depression, all that kind of stuff.
Alan Cruz says, as with many of us in this pandemic, his people-pleasing skills got stressed out, so he reached out for professional support.
It's the same thing. You go to a doctor to just get a checkup. Man, there's nothing wrong with going to a therapist or a counselor every once in a while to just get a checkup. You know what I mean? Right. Even if you don't feel bad.
Those checkups might also help us help others. Recent violent events, such as this Independence Day shooting in Illinois, remind us, according to psychologist Allison Mecca, that mental health concerns clearly are a public health problem.
We really want to keep an eye out for the people that we love. So if we start to see them withdrawing from things they typically enjoy doing, feeling a little bit more sick or physically ill, or complaining of feeling sick and physically unwell, if we start to notice there's a change in their mood, maybe they're more irritable, it's probably a good sign to say, hey, I should probably check in and see how this person's doing, because all of us are going through a lot right now, and we're only going to get through it if we stay together and look out for each other.
Cruz said his mental health checkup helped him slow down his daily pace, find what filled him, and realize he can't do life alone. He says if seeing someone in person isn't in your comfort zone, you can also get a virtual mental health check now online.
The mind is an important thing. It controls everything.
Those virtual visits are likely to be covered by medical insurance plans and may lower wait times for a check-in or check-up. I'm medical reporter Liz Bonis. Now back to you.
Comprehending the mental health system. Is it something that everyone is cut out for? First of all, you have to have some experience with mental health. You have to have seen a number of therapists or have experience with a psychologist. You need to have experienced the system first off. And then, you need to try to have some sort of unbiased perspective on their analysis of you. And for me, I've seen a number of different therapists. First one said I had social anxiety. Next one said I had depression. And then finally, I had one that said I was bipolar type 2. And she's the one who ended up being involved in me getting Baker's acted. That's when I was in the mental hospital for a few days. I saw a guy in Vegas who basically just said that I should try getting off gluten. And he called it like the autism diet. He says, you know, like gluten, people who are gluten sensitive, you can get basically like autism from gluten. So I kind of feel like he was kind of hinting at me having autism, depression, social anxiety, bipolar type 2, autism. I received so many different labels from these people, which all involve different kinds of treatments. And I remember at UNLV, they have you process on this computer before you get to speak to anyone. And the computer asks you all of these questions with a scroll down bar. How many times do you feel hopeless? How many times do you have thoughts of worthlessness? How many times do you feel this? It's trying to like diagnose you with something with a computer. And I ended up not answering any of the questions. I said the same answer for everything. And then I finally get to talk to somebody at UNLV and they're like, we noticed that you didn't really give us any information on the computer. It's like, well, yeah, I don't really want to be processed with a mental illness by a fucking computer survey, you know? It's this very impersonal process. And for what it sounds like, oh, you can get virtual visits. It sounds like it's becoming more and more impersonal. They're just trying to figure out what mental illness you have so they can hurry up and give you pills. And I have never tried taking medication because then, you know, there's one thing having experience with mental health. Then you could have an experience like on different medications. And some people are like, man, it killed my sex drive, or it made me fat, or I didn't like the way it made me feel. And then I got off of them, and that caused problems as well. A lot of people have problems with the mental health industry, and it is taught to us like it's this infallible science when, you know, people who study science will acknowledge that it's a soft science. And people like myself will consider hard science soft science on some level as well, depending on your definition of soft science is. But in conclusion, I get this feeling that society is more interested in determining whether or not you're dangerous than it is with like making you feel better. Like you're being processed like a potential threat through mental health. And maybe a lot of people don't see it that way, but I guess it depends what kind of a person you are. And I can just tell you that in my experience, opening up to people who ultimately work for the state isn't really a good idea. Once had a therapist agree with me instead of my girlfriend at the time to arrange the session, and she was mad the whole car ride home and never booked another session. All right, no comments here. Well, we got this article here. Looks like we're barely going to squeak out 2 hours today. It's, you know, if the podcast's an hour and a half, sometimes it's not a big deal, but we're hitting 7 p.m. right now. We got this video here. The end is in sight, my friends. Let's see what this article's all about. Why American teens are so sad. 4 forces are propelling the rising rates of depression among young people. So this came out April 2022, decently recent. The United States is experiencing an extreme teenage mental health crisis. From 2009 to 2021, the share of American high school students who say they feel persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness rose from 26% to 44%, according to a new CDC study. This is the highest level of teenage sadness ever recorded. The government survey of almost 8,000 high school students, which was conducted in the first 6 months of 2021, found a great deal of variation in mental health among different groups. More than 1 in 4 girls reported that they had seriously contemplated attempting suicide during the pandemic, which was twice the rate of boys. Nearly half of the LGBTQ teens said they had contemplated suicide during the pandemic, compared with 14% of their heterosexual peers. Sadness among white teens seems to be rising faster than among other groups. Here we go. Ooh. Sadness among white teens seems to be rising faster than among other groups. All right, The Atlantic. Saying the thing that's nobody wants to say. So yeah, LGBT people seem to really deal with feelings of sadness or depression. I'm sorry, I don't wish sadness upon anybody. Seriously. But the big picture is the same across all categories. Almost every measure of mental health is getting worse for every teenage demographic, and it's happening all across the country. Since 2009, sadness and hopelessness have increased for every race. For straight teens and gay teens, for teens who say they've never had sex, and for those who say they've had sex, with males and or females, for students in each year of high school, and for teens in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Women always contemplate suicide, then fail most of the time at attempting it. When men do it, it's for real. Yeah. Yep. So why is this happening? Oh, here we go. Yeah. Why is this happening? Let's hear about it, The Atlantic. I want to propose several answers to that question, along with one meta explanation that ties them together. But before I start with that, I want to squash a few tempting fallacies. First fallacy is that we can chalk this all up to teens behaving badly. In fact, lots of self-reported teen behaviors are moving in a positive direction. Since the 1990s, drinking and driving is down almost 50%. School fights are down 50%. Sex before 13 is down more than 70%. School bullying is down, and LGBTQ acceptance is up. I don't even know what that means, dude. It's hard for me to visualize what kind of school Zoomers are going to these days, bro. Like, there was still fights in my school. There was people having sex in my school. There was bullying and drinking and driving, and all of that was at my school. I don't really know how all of that stuff would have gone down. I think a lot of Zoomer guys are just completely disinterested in school, and they want to go home and like drool over TikTok videos and Minecraft. So I don't know. And that's just kind of my probably somewhat ignorant take on it. Yeah, interesting statistics there. And the acceptance of LGBTQ is up. I wonder what sample size they're deriving all this from. Second fallacy is that teens have always been moody, and sadness looks like it is rising only because people are more willing to talk about it. Objective measures of anxiety and depression, such as eating disorders, self-harming behavior, and teen suicides, are sharply up over the past decade. Across the country, we have witnessed dramatic increases in emergency departments visits for all mental health emergencies, including suspected suicide attempts. The American Academy of Pediatrics said in October, "Today's teenagers are more comfortable talking about mental health, but rising youth sadness is no illusion." The third fallacy is that today's mental health crisis was principally caused by the pandemic and an overreaction to COVID. Rising teenage sadness isn't a new trend, but rather the acceleration and broadening of a trend that clearly started before the pandemic. Lawrence Steinberg, a psychologist at Temple University, told me. But he added, we shouldn't ignore the pandemic either. The fact that COVID seems to have made teen mental health worse offers clues about what's really driving the rise in sadness. Here are 4 forces propelling that increase. Social media use. I believe it. 5 years ago, the psychologist Jean Twenge wrote an influential and controversial feature in The Atlantic titled, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" She had noticed that teen sadness and anxiety began to steadily rise in the U.S. and other rich, developed countries. She looked for explanations and realized that 2012 was precisely when the share of Americans who owned a smartphone surpassed 50% and mobile social media use spiked. In the past few years, scientists have disputed the idea that social media use itself makes teenagers miserable. Haha, of course they have. There's been absolutely hundreds of social media and mental health studies, almost all showing pretty small effects. But I think Twenge's strongest point is misunderstood. Social media isn't like rat poison, which is toxic to almost everyone. It's more like alcohol, a mildly addictive substance that can enhance social situations, but can also lead to dependency and depression among a minority of users. This is very close to the conclusion reached by none other than Instagram. The company's internal research from 2020 found that while most users had a positive relationship with the app, 1/3 of teen girls said Instagram made them feel worse, even though these girls feel unable to stop themselves from logging on. And if you don't believe a company owned by Facebook, believe a big new study from Cambridge University, in which researchers looked at 84,000 people of all ages and found that social media was strongly associated with worse mental health during certain sensitive life periods, including for girls ages 11 to 13. Why would social media affect teenage mental health in this way? One explanation is that teenagers are uniquely sensitive to the judgment of friends, teachers, and the digital crowd. As I've written, social media seems to hijack this keen peer sensitivity and drive obsessive thinking about body image and popularity. The problem isn't just that social media fuels anxiety, but also that, as we'll see, it makes it harder for today's young people to cope with the pressures of growing up. As soon as I stopped Facebook, Instagram, and video games, I started enjoying the present moment and setting goals and succeeding at my life. Sociality is down. I tell parents all the time that if Instagram is merely displacing TV, I'm not concerned about it, Steinberg told me, but today's teens spend more than 5 hours daily on social media. And that habit seems to be displacing quite a lot of beneficial activity. The share of high school students who got 8 or more hours of sleep declined 30% from 2007 to 2019. The pandemic and the closure of schools likely exacerbated teen loneliness and sadness. A 2020 survey from Harvard's Graduate School of Education found that loneliness spiked in the first year of the pandemic for everyone, but it rose most significantly for young people. Aloneness isn't the same as loneliness, and loneliness isn't the same as depression, but more aloneness, including from heavy smartphone use, and more loneliness, including from school closures, might have combined to push up sadness among teenagers who need sociality to protect them from pressures of a stressful world. The world is stressful, and there's more news about the world stressors. All right, that's pretty straightforward. Modern parenting strategies. In the past 40 years, American parents, especially those with a college degree, have nearly doubled the amount of time they spend coaching, chauffeuring, tutoring, and otherwise helping their teenage children. The economist Valerie Ramey has labeled this the rug rat race. High-income parents in particular are spending much more time preparing their kids for a competitive college admissions process. Ha ha! And this is what I'm always talking about. That was not my experience. My parents were not preparing me for anything. When I interviewed Ramey about her work in 2019, she told me that she couldn't believe the amount of pressure our friends were putting on their kids to get ready for college. Well, it's funny that this article is speaking of that as the problem, because that's what I wish that I had. And that's just where it comes down to life being hard. Like, oh, I wish my parents wouldn't try to help me get ready for college. It's like, bro, but if they don't do that, then you won't be ready for college. And you'll screw up your life. Okay, guys. Well, let's skip to the conclusion. Other explanations don't fit neatly into the above categories. Maybe drugs are a big factor. One study found that 1/6 of the increase in teen suicides was associated with parental opioid addiction. College campuses and internet culture have come to celebrate fragility. Maybe political polarization is fueling anxiety not only by creating mutual hatred, but also by encouraging people to reject opposing views, which over time reduces their capacity to handle cognitive dissonance in a confusing world. Absolutely. I mean, and I think that should be directed towards the left not being accepting of the right. And that's the hard thing for people to admit. Because when we're seeing like 60% female attendance at university, it's a feminized culture that's being pushed and accepted. Being conservative, ultimately, I think, is more masculine. The truth is, I'm not satisfied by any of the above explanations on their own, but I see no reason to keep them alone. They interact, amplify, and compound, and together they paint a powerful picture. The world is overwhelming, and an inescapably negative news cycle creates an atmosphere of existential gloom, not just for teens, but also for their moms and dads. The more overwhelming the world feels to parents, the more they may try to bubble wrap their kids with accommodations. Over time, this protective parenting style deprives children of the emotional resilience they need to handle the world's stresses. The childhood becomes more insular. Time spent with friends, driving, dating, and working summer jobs all decline. College pressures skyrocket. Outwardly, teens are growing up slower, but they're online. They're growing up faster. But online, they're growing up faster. The internet exposes teenagers not only to supportive friendships, but also to bullying, threats, despairing conversations about mental health, and a slurry of unsolvable global problems. A carnival of negativity. Social media places in every teen's pocket a quantified battle royale for scarce popularity that can displace hours of sleep and makes many teens, especially girls, feel worse about their body and life. Amplify these existing trends with a global pandemic and an unprecedented period of social isolation, and suddenly the remarkable rise of teenage sadness doesn't feel all that mysterious, does it? I think that article is decently insightful. There are big philosophical problems at play when it comes to a decline in happiness. And of course, I always point out how a lot of the big questions aren't being addressed and aren't being asked. But I think there's people out there who are ready to address it, you know? They're ready to start saying, okay, it's getting to a point where all of these horrible patriarchal, literally white males, you're a fucking white male. These people are human beings, and there are children, and, you know, they're the future too. They matter. We're not just enemies, you know? Like a white man's struggle, we're talking about an American citizen, and we should be looking out for American people. It's like, by all means, you know, making life better for minorities is important. Making life better for women, I believe, is important. But it seems to be done in this rebellious way where it's like, oh, we're all just going to shit on the patriarchy and celebrate the destruction of the patriarchy. It's like, well, you know what? That patriarchy is still the majority of men in this country. And they're having hard times. Sounds like a lot of people are having hard times. But I think academia and society's approach to this is going to have to change from the angle of, like, you know, millennials in general, living with their family, depression in our generation. People are going to have to start opening their minds up. I only ever had Facebook, and I quit that 10 years ago because it was too painful. I realized nobody was actually there to talk. They were there to brag about themselves. The women with poems over their pictures staring off in the distance was the breaking point. Yeah, I'm kind of in limbo with a number of things, but I probably shouldn't be on Facebook either. Sometimes I feel like it's my only hope to, like, have any social success here, but it's not giving me any hope. It's not working out. Okay, guys, a video on the counter-reformation. Let's learn a little bit about it. Counter-reformation, this is ultimately more or less where the Jesuits came from. Let's go.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So last week we took a break from religion to show that amidst warfare and bitter controversy over doctrine, people were also inventing and innovating and enslaving. Europeans were eating new foods, hanging out more in cities, and making advances in commerce and legal protections for some people, while also inventing systems of oppression to enslave others. Years ago, historians firmly believed that the Protestant religion promoted capitalism. That is, all the business and commerce that were springing up at the time were caused by the Reformation. Some historians still find that Martin Luther's other worldly interests expanded to this worldly activities like reading in ways that boosted prosperity, but the rise of capitalism was complex, and also it happened in non-Protestant communities. So today, let's shift perspectives back to how the Catholics were handling all this. Were they ready to simply surrender their influence in European society? Did the Church just turn its back on this momentous challenge of Protestantism and continued down its much criticized path? No, they responded. Leaders in the faithful created a sturdy, even strident Catholic Reformation, or counter-reformation, that also provided a little grease to the wheels of commerce. And today, we're going to look at the Catholic Reformation and how it influenced not just Europe, but the world. The task of reform fell to Pope Paul III, who, like many Renaissance popes, lived in the lap of luxury and engaged in corrupt practices such as appointing 2 of his grandsons cardinals in their early teens. He only hired the best people. Also, why does this pope have grandsons? That reminds me of the great last words of the Irish poet Brendan Behan. A nun was giving him an injection, and he turned to her and said, "Bless you, sister. May all your sons be bishops." Then he died. But Pope Paul III did understand, partly because of external pressure, that the Catholic Church needed to shape up. Several attempts at undertaking reforms in formal meetings were blocked by powerful individuals, though, who liked the status quo. Powerful individuals in the status quo. The greatest love story of this or any time. But the Church was tired of seeing its overall power decrease. So in 1545, the Council of Trent, composed of high church officials, assembled to stop the Protestant momentum. And this council continued until 1563, a series of meetings that lasted so long that by the time it was over, both Pope Paul III and his successor Julius III had died. I've definitely had meetings that felt 18 years long. I'm not sure if they were, though. So among the adherents to Protestantism were some of the most powerful princes and members of the nobility in Europe, and some Catholic leaders wanted those Protestants on their side. But eventually, the council decided not to compromise. Instead, the pronouncements of the Council of Trent were stark and emphatic. Already in 1542, while waiting for a council actually to get organized, the papacy had expanded the work of the Inquisition, which had been established in the 13th century to stamp out heresies in southern France and Italy. But now the Inquisition targeted Protestants and searched for heresy also among conquered people in the New World. The council also affirmed principles of transubstantiation, that is, the belief that the blood and wine of the communion sacrament become the actual body and blood of Jesus. It upheld the centrality of the 7 sacraments, and the selling of indulgences stuck around too. Clergy were to remain celibate and chaste, unlike most Protestant clerics, and all Catholics were to continue to live by faith and practice good works as their path to salvation, not by faith alone like the Protestants. The Church also began establishing seminaries where priests could become more informed in Catholic theology, and reformers felt this training was sorely needed for priests because they were being confronted by complicated Protestant challenges to Catholic doctrine. And the Church began the Papal Index, a list of books that Catholics were forbidden to read. In addition, the Church reached deeper into society when it began to further regulate marriages. With the creation of a list of forbidden books and the declaration of power over marriage, the Counter-Reformation took Catholicism from a point of weakness and actually expanded its power, at least over those who believed. Even before these events, what would become a major bulwark of Catholicism and its Counter-Reformation was taking shape, because in the 1520s, after being shot as a soldier in one of Spain's wars, a Spanish nobleman took up the challenge to fortify Catholicism. Just as Luther wrestled with his faith, Ignatius of Loyola suffered spiritual agonies and emerged as a charismatic leader. But unlike Luther, Ignatius and his followers remained loyal to the Catholic Church. In 1540, the Pope declared Ignatius's followers a religious order called the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. Many pre-existing Catholic religious orders were rededicating themselves to protect and nourish their faith, but Loyola's approach was especially effective given the challenges from Protestantism in the 1520s and thereafter. First, because he organized and ran his group like an army around a hierarchy of command. Joining required several years of training and a strict code of discipline, and all of that was timely because of the church's reputation for corruption and lax morals, and in many cases, priestly incompetence, including ignorance of Latin. That wasn't a problem with the Jesuits. Second, the Jesuits founded schools where humanistic education thrived alongside religious instruction. These became a mechanism for combining the latest in intellectual practice with the revitalization and reaffirmation of Catholic theology, and it was important because one of the attractions of Protestantism was its emphasis on broader literacy so that everyone could connect directly with Scripture. The Jesuits argued that Catholics could also spread education, which is why, incidentally, there are so many Loyola universities around the world. And that brings us to our final point about the Jesuits. In addition to reforming Catholicism in Europe, the Jesuits undertook globalizing the faith as a regular part of their mission. Through them, Catholicism truly did become a world religion, reaching India and Japan and Africa and the New World. And this Jesuit activism in establishing global relationships would eventually transform Europe in ways that have only recently gained the attention of historians. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Jesuits interacted worldwide with an eye on both short and long-term results. They wanted to convert souls, but they also wanted through schools to shape the way that young people learned and thus their perspective. It's important to remember that no education is morally neutral. What you learn about shapes the way you look at the world. And as they traveled, the Jesuits were in constant touch with one another, comparing best practices, and they also...
All right. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Supreme. Like, reacting, I don't know, but I'm going to react to this a little bit right now. The way I see it with the Jesuits is that the order wasn't necessarily inherently a terrible thing, but you look at this global system. You look at how the Jesuits' goal was to globalize Catholicism, and how they ended up being this international element. If someone was to subvert the Jesuits, it would be a very convenient vessel for whatever your agenda is, because they were global, international. It would be a great front, you know, if you have some sort of a secret, devious agenda underneath what you claim your agenda is. So the way I see it is that the Jesuit order was a powerful organization that could ultimately benefit. It could benefit anyone, you know, anybody who wanted to have a global outreach. It would be very convenient for them to subvert the Jesuit order.
Adapted different strategies to different parts of the world as their order spread across the globe. They studied local languages before approaching people, and in many cases took elements from local beliefs and tried to persuade those they wished to convert that Catholic beliefs were basically identical to local ones. And this was effective. In China, there were 38,000 converts to Catholicism by 1633. By 1650, there were over 100,000. Once the Jesuits established these global contacts, they produced reports, first in Latin, but then translated into local European languages, and their work created a Eurocentric globalization that ended up going way beyond religion. For example, they became an early version of industrial spies when it came to producing porcelain, reporting back from...
Jesuits became early industrial spies. See, they did seem to be like a proto-intelligence kind of a community. Things like the CIA were somewhat modeled after the Jesuits. Hitler even said that his organization was somewhat modeled after the Jesuits. The Milner Group in the Anglo establishment, in that book, they even said that they modeled their order after the Jesuits. Jesuits was more or less the first secret society. Maybe after Freemasonry. I feel like the origins of Freemasonry are a little skewed, but yeah.
From China to Europe about the processes that went into making high-quality porcelain. Spreading Catholicism was their mission, but the Jesuits were among those advancing commercial and agricultural development as well. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Many Catholics really took the Church's reforms to heart, intensifying their devotion, sometimes in ways that also helped further the religion's influence around the world. Among the most renowned was the Spanish mystic and nun Saint Teresa of Avila, who had a very long birth name that I will not attempt to pronounce. I mean, mispronouncing things is my thing, but there's no reason to go down that road. At 20, she escaped the confines of her home, where she was recuperating from one of her many and lifelong bouts of illness, to join the Carmelite order of nuns, but once there, she balked at the superficiality and the high society life of constant visits and fancy food. She began to live out the Reformed Church's rededication to faith and good works, being extremely strict in her practice. She was a proponent of self-flagellation ceremonies, self-flagellation being the act of hitting oneself with a whip in imitation of Christ's suffering at the cross. And she became an inspiration, particularly after church leaders had her write down her spiritual experiences in several books that have now become counter-reformation classics, such as Way of Perfection and the Book of Foundations. At the same time, she went about founding new discalciate, that is shoeless or barefoot, Carmelite religious orders, restoring austerity and strictness to religious life. The Council of Trent had also issued a statement about art, advising that it needed to connect with ordinary people, including the poor. The aim was not to produce subtle or erudite symbolism, but to strike emotions, inducing awe and evoking the power and majesty of the divine. Gian Lorenzo Bernini produced such effects, for example, in the piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica. It features massed columns, which produce a dramatic setting for papal ritual. Protestants had smashed ornate statuary of saints and the Holy Family, and instead created simple, unadorned places of worship. But Catholics embraced majestic religious interiors, enhancing religious figures through the use of light and shade in paintings of Jesus and angels and saints and the royalty surrounding the divine, all of which were part of a new style called Baroque. Did the world just open? Is there a tiny little baby Jesus dressed up fancy back there? Indeed, it is the infant of Prague, or at least a $3 recreation of it. So you can see here this baby Jesus is in a very fancy dress. And listen, if I were a tiny baby Jesus, I would wear this fancy dress. But if you've read the Gospels, you'll know that, this is not how tiny baby Jesus dressed. It is, however, super Baroque, emphasizing... Yet it expressed the ecstatic relationship with the divine and an overflow of feeling and belief. Likewise, Baroque music expressed complexity through the use of counterpoint and emotional and thunderous chords that filled parishioners, both illiterate and learned, with religious awe. One artist who took up the Baroque style, some would say with a vengeance, was Artemisia Gentileschi. Trained by her father, Orazio, Gentileschi was raped by a man who'd been hired to give her additional instruction. She herself was tortured with thumbscrews by the court in order to ensure that she was telling the truth when her father brought suit against the rapist. One of the few ways to get revenge? Painting. The frightening Judith Slay's Holofernes, for instance, shows the biblical heroine and her maid getting revenge on the general Holofernes who threatened her people's survival. From the dramatic imagery to the high contrast of dark and light, this painting is exemplary of counter-reformation art. It evokes the senses and an emotional connection to God's word, and it ain't subtle. So between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, people obsessively confronted some of the major issues of human existence, right? Faith, the divine, the human conduct that should accompany religious belief, and we're still not finished with the repercussions of that questioning and the responses to it. These religious upheavals weren't just about how to get into heaven, they were also about who should learn and how, and what constituted an effective human life. We are still in the shadow of those who modeled new ideas of what matters in human life. And we'll have much more to say about Catholicism and the role of organized...
Alrighty, yeah, so... Counter-reformation, Ignatius Loyola, first Jesuit, founder of the Society of Jesus, Jesuit order. They wanted to spread Catholicism across the world, which is part of the Great Commission. So I feel like they were just a powerful organization that fell into the wrong hands, perhaps. But I still don't have all the answers. Wolfgang is classified as hard men, and it's just one word. There's no space. It's the name Wolfgang, not a gang of wolves. All right, my friends. Well, that's the 2-hour mark. I'm feeling a little bit sleepy. I'm a little bit burnt out for today, but I think 2 hours is honestly about the perfect length for the podcast. It's been special. Had some very special rants today. I'm trying to switch the topics a bit up tomorrow. See if we can kind of hit things from a different angle. So, God bless you, my friends. It's been real. And I will see y'all tomorrow.